Welcome to lesson one of ES3, Where is the Earth Changing? And we're going to be dealing with activity 1.1 today, Worldwide Patterns of Volcanoes. So our learning target is we're going to identify patterns in the world of volcanoes. And so where are these volcanoes located? And so we're going to see if there's any patterns involved with that. And you're going to be looking at a map. The expectation is that you finish activity 1.1, which is found on page 1 and 2 this year. And I say this year because sometimes the company switches the pages and the books up a little bit, so it's not always on the same pages. So I'd like you to make observations and finish activity 1.1 today. So when you think of volcanoes, what do you know? What have you heard about volcanoes? And we're going to discuss briefly some of the volcanoes that may have made the news recently and some famous volcanoes of the past. And we're only going to touch on a few of those volcanoes because volcanoes have had a significant impact on the Earth's history over time. Now, when you think of volcanoes, you don't usually think of the United States, do you? Well, maybe we should. So let's start taking a look. So here, if you want to work on pronouncing this is Iceland. And this volcano erupted several years ago. And it had a huge impact. It put up so much ash and dust into the atmosphere, and the atmosphere is carrying that dust right over Europe. It actually grounded all air traffic for several days in Europe, or at least Western Europe. How about this volcano? Have you ever heard of Krakatoa? Well, Krakatoa, some scientists theorize that Krakatoa made the world's loudest sound ever. The sound that was made in 1883. And it was so loud it actually ruptured the eardrums of people 40 miles away. So if you can imagine being here in Baraboo, 40 miles away would be almost to Madison. So you can imagine, a noise so loud that it causes your eardrums to blow. That's a loud, loud sound. And it actually traveled around the world 4 times and was clearly heard 3,000 miles away. So that's almost across our entire country. It was so loud. So the next time your parents tell you to turn down the music, it's too loud, well, that was very soft music compared to the sound that Krakatoa made. How about this one? Mount Pelée. Mount Pelée is on the Caribbean island of Martinique. And it unleashed an eruption that killed approximately 30,000 people. And it had the highest death toll of any volcanic activity in the 20th century. But one of the interesting stories that I always heard from this eruption is that in one small community, only one person survived. How do you think they survived? Where do you think they were? How do you think they were able to survive? Well, think about when we were. It's 1902. What are some of the strongest structures in town? Now, a lot of times when I ask students this, they'll say, oh, the bank. That's a very good guess. But what's the next strongest structure in town? If you're thinking it's the jail, you're right. And from what I always heard, it was a convicted murderer survived that eruption. And because they were in jail, that's how they were able to survive. And I always heard that the governor of the island granted that prisoner pardon after the eruption because they survived. And they theorized that if they survived this, well, they've already gone through a great ordeal. We're going to pardon you. And they were able to go free. This is one of the neat things that I was able to witness last summer. You might be looking at these and thinking, what are these? Well, Mount Vesuvius, that's an Italian volcano. It was on the island of Sicily. And it erupted in 79 AD. And one of the interesting things about it is the city was lost for many, many years. So if you can imagine, and they've made movies about this, so go watch the movie Pompeii, get a much better idea of what happened there. But Mount Pelée erupted, and the people knew something was going on. A lot of people evacuated the city, but not everybody did. And it erupted. A lot of people died. Now, the city of Vesuvius was lost, or not the Pompeii was lost. Vesuvius was the volcano. And it was lost for many, many years. They just didn't know where it was. The volcano, wiped everything off the map. Everything that could have identified where the city was lost. So they just couldn't find it. Now, eventually, archaeologists were able to find it. And one of the things that they were doing is when they were digging around, they kept finding these air pockets, these cavities in the ground. And they didn't know what these cavities were. So someone had the idea of putting some plaster of Paris down there. At least I always heard it was plaster of Paris. And it filled in these cavities and it hardened. And then they were able to take away the rock from around the cavities. And what they found were these lifelike statues that were left behind. So what scientists are theorizing is that when the people died, when they suffocated from the ash and their lungs were burnt from the hot air, they were succumbed to the gas, that they died in place. The ash buried them, and eventually the ash hardened around their bodies. Well, what happens to bodies? Well, bodies are going to decompose over time. So you might be thinking, why do you have two different pictures of the same thing? Well, this last summer, and this would have been in the summer of 1990, no, not 1990, but 2019, I went down to St. Louis on vacation for the summer. I wanted to stop in and see lots of different things that were in St. Louis, such as the Arch. I wanted to stop at Lincoln's Tomb on the way down and Springfield. And this is one of the places I went. This was at the museum in St. Louis. And they actually had an exhibit called Vesuvius. So here's pictures that I've always had. And these are pictures that I've had in the past. But they actually had the actual casts of these there. So I could see the actual remnants. And it's not only that one, but here as well. I've got lots of other pictures. So you can see how detailed these are. So this is the one that I actually saw. And I didn't even have to go all the way to Italy to see it. So this was neat. So you might want to check this summer and see if St. Louis is a place you can visit and if they still have the exhibit, or you can see where the exhibit is if it's still in the United States. So they're able to find all these different casts. So that's one of the neat things about Mount Vesuvius when it erupted. Hawaiian Islands. We've heard of the Hawaiian Islands, and we haven't heard about them recently. And this is one of the first eruptions in the United States that had a major impact on our life. And a lot of times when we think of volcanoes, we don't usually think of the United States. But when we look, here are a whole bunch of volcanoes located in the U.S. that the U.S. deems as a very high threat. And this doesn't even include Alaska. So Alaska is going to have some more of these. In fact, here's a quote from the article where I found this picture. The USA is one of the most active countries in the world when it comes to volcanic activity, she said, noting that there have been 120 eruptions in the United States since 1980. So a lot of times we don't think of the United States as being largely volcanic or having much volcanic activity, but it does have a lot. In fact, it's one of the most active countries in the world. So this is what we're going to do today. Is if you're looking on page 2 of your book, and that's, again, the pages could differ, but we're on activity 1.1, it says that I'm going to show you, well, it actually says your teacher will give you a world map, but I'm going to show you a world map. And you have one in your book on page 1, but I'm going to show you a color version of it. Might be a little bit easier to read. And it's going to be of locations of volcanoes on Earth. First thing I want you to do is look and see if you see any patterns in where earthquakes, or not earthquakes, but where volcanoes are found. Then look for places in which no volcanoes are found. And if you're doing this by yourself, you can just think about it. You can pause the video, take a look. But if you're with your team, take a look at where these volcanoes are. Talk about them, discuss them, and see if there seems to be a pattern that you can find. So here's the map. And go ahead and pause the video if you want. And just see if you see, are there any patterns? Where are volcanoes located? Where are volcanoes not located? So go ahead and pause the video, think about this for a few minutes, or talk with your group about this for a few minutes. All right, so hopefully you paused the video and you had a chance to think about it. Now what I'd like you to do is answer question 1. It's a making sense question on page 2 of your book. What patterns do you notice in areas where volcanoes are located on Earth? So go ahead and pause the video and just write a sentence or two. What patterns did you find, or what patterns did your group find? All right, so you had a chance to think about this and to jot something down. So what I'd like you to do now is take a look at question number 2. What ideas do you have about why there might be patterns in the volcanic data, the volcano data that you saw. So you saw where volcanoes are erupting. Why do you think there's a pattern there? Why do you think there's a pattern there? And do you have any ideas about why they're there? So go ahead and pause the video and discuss this with your team, or think about it by yourself if you're doing it on your own. And just write me a sentence or two. And then unpause the video when you're done. All right, so your team's had a chance. So let's look at number one. What patterns did you notice? Did you notice that the volcanoes are located all over the world and they're often in lines? So if I look at this, you can see there's one long, and it's not a traditional line like in math where it's straight across or it's linear. But if we were to trace this with a marker, we could draw a circle that would come almost all around the map. And there's other spots here too. But we notice that they tend to form lines. They tend to form patterns. Maybe you said that a lot of the active volcanoes are found on the edges of the plates. And that's true. Not all of them are on the edge of the continents. Sorry. So a lot of them are there, but yet there are still some that are located in the ocean. Now, you're correct. A lot of them tend to be on the edge of continents, but not all of them. Here you see a bunch in the middle. So were you able to find any other connections, any other patterns that you notice? Maybe you said that we don't see a lot in the oceans. You might want to think about, why is that? Why don't we see a lot of volcanoes in the ocean? I don't know. Could it be that there are volcanoes and a lot of them down in the bottom of the ocean? We just don't see them because the water is covering it up and we don't notice when they erupt? And that's a good possibility. So that's going to be it. If we were doing this in class, I'd be showing you these videos. If you want to look these up and just type in Chile volcanic eruption and type in this date, Mount St. Helens, May 18th, 1980, or Paracutin, Mexico, 1943, you would see some really neat volcanoes that have erupted. This one right here is quite a ways ago. You weren't born there, but I remember this. And this is the last major eruption, other than the one that happened in the Hawaiian Islands a few years ago. But this was the largest eruption in my lifetime here in the United States. And Paracutin also has a very interesting history. So watch that video. It was one of the first volcanoes that scientists were able to see being born, where it started in a farmer's cornfield and it grew and it grew and it grew. So scientists were actually able to observe it from the very, very beginning, its birth, all the way till it was fully formed and erupting. So take a look at those. Again, as always, if you have any questions about Activity 1.1, just please let your teacher know. Thanks.